This segment of WGCU's Local Untold Stories is underwritten by Collier County Government, County Commission, the District School Board of Collier County, City of Naples, City Council, the Barron Collier Jr. Foundation, and the Collier County Museum.
Frankly, I was fascinated with Florida and swept off my feet by what I saw and felt. It was a wonderland with a magic climate set in a frame of golden sunshine.
Barron Collier was the American success story, which every immigrant son, every American who worked for him respected, understood, and hoped beyond hope would happen to them. Collier had the keen business sense. He had the drive, the motivation to get it done.
Collier's drive and determination not only made him an icon in the advertising business, but it also brought him to Southwest Florida, where he left behind indelible footprints. As one of the area's first major stakeholders, he saw its incredible potential and laid the critical groundwork for its development, from Useppa Island to Everglades City.
He was an optimist. He had enormous faith in this area of the world. The sun shines, and he wasn't particularly fond of cold winters up north, and so he figured everybody else was the same way.
He thought so much of Florida and all, and was so much of himself in what he did down here and all. It was certainly an integral part of his life.
I wish I had known him. He had great vision, and fell in love with Florida.
It all started on March 23, 1873, when Barron Gift Collier was born in Memphis, Tennessee, to Cowles Miles Collier and Hannah Celeste Shackelford Collier.
His father was a U.S. naval officer before the Civil War, but after the Civil War broke out, he joined the Confederacy in the Army. He was a native of Virginia, of Hampton, Virginia.
Military tradition played an important part in the Collier family, and Barron's parents named their young son after war heroes, Hampton Naval Officer Samuel Barron the Younger and Confederate Lieutenant George Gift. The post-Civil War era into which Barron Gift Collier was born was shaped by an economic panic. In the big cities, there was hunger and despair. And in proud, defeated Memphis, many prominent families were living in genteel poverty. Barron Collier's parents, too, had lost some of their wealth in the war. Nonetheless, they remained a family of position.
There's not much written about his early childhood, but we know he was fairly well off, even though there are lots of myths about him being from a poor family. And we know that through photographic evidence, seeing the types of pictures that have been taken of him, the kind of clothing he's wearing, that sort of thing.
It has been said that Barron Gift Collier was a husky, active boy with a deep love of nature and poetic mysticism attributed to his Celtic ancestors. At age 16, Barron Collier quit school and went to work. The military held no appeal for him. After all, the Civil War had destroyed his father's career. Instead, he entered the business world.
Business and more business was the first stimulus to my vital spark.
What he did in Memphis, his very first job right after he left school, was to work for a railroad company soliciting cargo from other people, and he was very, very successful at that.
Determined to succeed, Barron Collier used the capital gained from his first business venture to start out on another.
He took that money and then approached the city of Memphis, and this is the type of thing that he did through his career. He was always a visionary. He saw what the next trend was coming along, and he had read about gas street lighting, and Memphis didn't have that yet, and he went to the city and proposed that they switch to this new kind of lighting, and he got the sole municipal contract for that.
Collier used the profits made from the Memphis street lamp enterprise and invested it in a local printing plant, a choice of destiny. One of the least profitable contracts the printer had was with a firm that sold advertising cards that were placed in streetcars.
And at the time in Memphis, they were horse-drawn. They still hadn't become electrified yet. But once again, Barron Collier had read that there were electrified streetcars in major metropolitan areas, Boston, New York, Chicago.
And that got the young man to thinking. More and more Americans were leaving rural towns to find work in the great cities, where streetcars were quickly becoming the main mode of transportation. Barron Gift Collier seized the day.
The streetcar really was the working class conveyance. This is how you got around. He saw all those thousands of people riding those streetcars as a captive audience who would see a message not just once a day, but twice, maybe even more, and several times in a week. So it fit the advertising model of show it to them often and get it into their heads.
Collier knew that he could reach that audience and at the same time make money for the advertiser, the agency, and the trolley car company. He won the exclusive contract for all streetcar advertising in his hometown of Memphis. He sold the ads, printed the cards, put them in cars, and paid the streetcar system a fee for the privilege.
After just a couple of years, he was extremely successful at that and started to have franchises in places like Little Rock and New Orleans.
The young Barron Collier knew he was onto something and decided to take his successful venture a step further. During the panic year of 1893, he seized an opportunity to move up the financial ladder. Willing to take a risk, he moved his business to the Big Apple.
Collier realized early on that New York City was the business hub of the country, and as he put it, if you wanted to catch a big fish, you had to go where the big fish were. So he packed up his office from Memphis and moved to New York City.
He rented office space on 42nd Street, hired a staff, and called his company the Consolidated Street Railway Advertising Company.
I started in New York from Memphis with a one-way railroad ticket and a very small sum of money. Subsequently, I was to experience all the thrills, disappointments, and joys of cooling my heels outside the offices of big businessmen who did not seem particularly enthusiastic about seeing me and trying to struggle to the top of the heap.
Through his perseverance and his powers of persuasion, which apparently were very strong, he was able to get clients in New York and build his business up in New York. Pretty soon he had franchises everywhere around the country, from New York to San Francisco, including in Canada and in Cuba. Had a very successful franchise working in Havana. So he did very, very well at it because he understood how the nation was going. And this is something, as I say, that follows him throughout his thinking. He's always just slightly ahead of the curve and sees what I would say the average person is looking for. He understood that. This wasn't playing to the rich. This was playing to the working class.
By age 26, Collier had made his first million. Eventually, he would own business interests ranging from hotels to steamship lines, including the Radium Springs Spa in Georgia and the famous Luna Park amusement complex on Coney Island. Collier's magnificent home was in Pocantico Hills, New York, right next to the John D. Rockefeller estate. He also owned a stately villa in Baden-Baden, Germany, as well as 3 yachts. Before long, Collier made friends with some of the wealthiest and most powerful citizens of the time, such as J.P. Morgan, William Randolph Hearst, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Coleman DuPont, and William Wrigley, the chewing gum tycoon. Yet no matter how powerful Collier became, he was always said to have had respect for Southern ways. As a matter of fact, it took the Memphis native a while to get used to the New York way of life.
When I first came to New York, I knew no one. I was appalled at the seeming discourtesy. A man would rush right by me, step on my feet, and never ask for pardon because he never expected to see me again. Often, when I arose to give my seat to a young woman, they thought I was trying to flirt. Once I had a fight with a man on an elevated train because when I got up to give a lady my seat, he jumped into it. I lifted him right out of the seat and she got in. He then appealed to the rest of the crowd and said I was a ruffian.
While business took center stage throughout Barron Collier's life, he did eventually also find time for family life. On November 26, 1907, at age 34, he married Juliet Gordon Carnes from Memphis, who was 11 years his junior.
She was quite a grand dame. She was from Memphis. That's where the two of them met. She was, I think, a lovely lady, very well-mannered, very well-spoken, well-taught in every way. She was a beautiful Southern lady. And I think he was a little more of a rough diamond, was my impression. At the time, my grandfather was not that well off, and she was from a very nice family, and he wooed her and won her after quite a while.
5 months after their nuptials, their first son, Barron Gift Collier Jr., was born in Memphis. On May 14, 1912, Samuel Carnes Collier was born in New York City, and 2 years later, Mrs. Collier gave birth to Cowles Miles Collier on August 27, 1914.
She, I believe, was a great help to my grandfather in many ways. Believed in him. I think she needed to have a lot of patience and everything, because he was the type of person who was, I've read a lot of autobiographies of Roosevelt and various other people, and people I think with this type of energy and drive are not necessarily the easiest people to live with. They're fascinating, but they're not easy to live with. And I think she found him to be a fascinating person to live with, but not always easy.
Many years later, Mr. Collier mused wistfully about his relationship with the opposite sex.
I must admit that at 55, I still do not understand women. In order to assist my perplexity, my wife has been sweet enough to bring me 3 sons and no daughters, so that it is apparent that I still have no chance to understand them.
It was around the time Barron Collier started his family that he began to develop a serious interest in Southwest Florida.
I think it was his business relationship with a gentleman from Chicago by the name of John Roach, who owned Useppa Island. Roach invited Collier down to this area of Southwest Florida, and specifically to Useppa Island, because there was nothing in this area at that time.
Collier comes and spends part of the winter here, and he likes it so much that he buys the hotel and the island from his friends. He makes it his kind of winter home.
That was in 1911.
After that, he begins looking around at property that's available. He thinks, well, Florida real estate is a good investment. So he begins looking, particularly in the area of South Lee County, where there was a lot of land that was for sale. And he begins accumulating parcels of land.
And oddly enough, he wasn't looking for developed land. He was looking for raw frontier. And Southwest Florida had plenty of that to offer in 1911.
He made an enormous amount of money at the time, pre-income taxes anyway. And so he took his funds and bought what ultimately became about 1,400,000 acres of Southwest Florida.
Before long, Barron Collier was the state's largest landowner, owning an area larger than the state of Delaware across what is now Collier, Lee, and Hendry counties. Now he was looking for ways to open up his land for development.
In the early 1920s, the Tamiami Trail, that was the major highway that had been proposed between Tampa and Miami, which were Florida's 2 major cities in those days, had come to a dead halt. Construction was stopped, it was stalled. So Barron Collier, who was active in this area, proposed to the state legislature that he would personally finance the completion of this road in exchange for the creation of a county, and it would be named Collier County in his honor. And the state went along with it and agreed that that was a pretty good deal. And that's how Collier County got its name.
That was in 1923. Shortly thereafter, Barron Collier went to work on the final stretch of the road, which crossed his large land holdings in the new county named for him.
The tomorrow of Florida is dawning. In its soft light, we see the forms of men literally hurling back the wilderness, draining large tracts, building homes, planting great gardens and orchards. Soon will come the blaze of a full midday. Picture it if you can, the scene as it will be then.
Building this road across the inhospitable Everglades was no small feat. Collier transformed the town of Everglades into his county seat, modernized it, and made it the base for his operations.
He made a promise that he would do it, and he did it, and he was a very determined man. I didn't really hear many stories about him because he died shortly after I was born. But I always had a wonderful impression of the man because of the way he built Everglades City, ran Everglades City. For example, he had a first-class library in Everglades City and insisted that we use it, and we did. He provided dance lessons for children. He really was concerned. He really cared about the people that worked for him.
Since he was busy running his advertising empire from New York, Barron Collier hired very capable men to look after his Florida interests for him.
He had hired a fellow named D. Graham Copeland, who was an engineer, to oversee the construction. And subsequent to the completion of the trail, Mr. Copeland became the head of the company.
Usually when Collier visited, he visited on his yacht. Sometimes he would come to Everglades City on his yacht. He would be in one of his offices there in Everglades City for, a couple of days. But usually if he was here in Southwest Florida, he was staying at his house on Yusepa, which he really loved. He really enjoyed it there.
Collier loved Yusepa so much that in 1926, he made the island his legal residence. Over the years, he had made vast improvements to his island retreat, putting his uncle, John Law Kerr, in charge of the day-to-day operations.
Once a week, he would write at least a one-page and usually 2 or 3-page, single-spaced letter every Friday afternoon to Barron Collier in his fancy office in New York, detailing every single minute thing that happened during the previous week. Every employee, hours of work, pay, bills, invoices. And Barron Collier once a week would faithfully respond to that letter with instructions from New York. And reading that correspondence is fascinating. It showed that Barron Collier, sitting in his fancy Taj Mahal office in Manhattan, really had a vital interest in the most minute details that were going on here on his island.
Collier wanted Yusepa to be an elegant place where wealthy Northerners could spend the winters.
Collier was a guy that didn't want any mixing between the employees and his guests that were down here. So he went out and built on a little adjacent island structure so his employees could party after they worked to keep his employees happy. And it was called the House of Whoopee. It was a little bar, and they had music there, and they danced and so forth. And of course, you could imagine what happened. All the fancy, wealthy guys that are down here fishing, when they got done with their fancy dinner in the fancy inn, they'd run upstairs, change into their dungarees, and head down to the House of Whoopee. Well, this didn't sit well with Mr. Collier, and so the House of Whoopee got burned down during the following spring after the guests had left.
At the same time Collier was busy building an empire in Florida, he also was actively involved in community work in New York. In 1922, he was appointed Special Deputy Police Commissioner for Public Safety after he came up with some innovative ideas to reduce the high number of traffic fatalities.
You've got to remember, this is a time when suddenly there's all kinds of motor traffic on city streets. The public wasn't used to that. Jaywalking was a big problem. People would walk in front of a vehicle.
So Mr. Collier launched out on this public safety campaign to try to cut down the number of fatalities and injuries associated with jaywalking. And he started a campaign called Anti-Jaywalker, who was a little police lady who basically said, what you should do, go to the corner, look both ways, all those things that we were probably taught when we were children. And in the first 90 days of the program, those accidents were reduced by 50%. And that, again, is Mr. Collier's power of persuasion and persistence to get a message to people. And it worked.
Anti-Jaywalker wasn't the only invention of Collier's that led to increased traffic safety.
You know, the double yellow line that you see in the middle of the road, that was a Barron Collier idea. Keep cars to one side of the road.
Collier also helped found Interpol, the International World Police.
He believed that criminals ought not to be able to escape justice by just simply going to another country. So he worked, for many years with European and South American authorities to transfer information about crimes and criminals all around the world so that the world would be a safer place.
Another organization Collier played a major role in was the Boy Scouts of America. Together with his good friend Franklin D. Roosevelt, he worked for many years to bring attention to the movement which offered boys and young men an opportunity for personal growth. In 1928, after pouring millions of dollars into the Sunshine State, Collier's ambitious road-building project was completed. But the big Florida boom had bust after the 1926 hurricane, and the growth Collier anticipated was slow to arrive.
A lot of his business associates warned him, this might not be a good time to invest in Florida or continue to invest in Florida. But Collier's famous for having said, no, we're going full steam ahead with our plans in Florida.
He also saw the beauty of the place and appreciated Florida for Florida, which a lot of people later on did not. So I think that's to his credit. The setting aside of land for public spaces, parks, that type of thing.
Collier, and later his sons, helped make Collier Seminole State Park, the Audubon Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, and Everglades National Park a reality.
Collier was a terrific person. He was fair and generous to his employees. He was a first-class citizen in terms of trying to make the world a better place. Even in things like his company town, he was well thought of by his employees. The natural inclination of some company towns to exploit their employees by raising prices in their stores, that wasn't the case with Barron Collier. So when we look back at Barron Collier, considering the time and looking at some of the people that we know were his friends, you say, gee, this was a heck of a guy. He was really a terrific guy.
But despite all of his hard work and ingenuity, not even Barron Collier could ultimately escape the hardships of the Great Depression. Before the bank holiday of 1933, he walked into his New York offices with $200,000 cash and said that would keep his operations going for a while. When cash became very scarce, Collier was able to turn to the thousands of dollars generated in pennies by one of his more obscure franchises, Subway gum machines. But eventually, as his advertising revenues declined to almost nothing, Collier could no longer meet all his financial obligations and had to ask his creditors for a moratorium on his debts.
I think he was an honest, hard-working businessman who I think got trapped, like a lot of honest, hard-working people, by the Depression. And I think he was leveraged and he got boxed, and that's how come that he had to, file for bankruptcy.
No matter how difficult things became, Collier never lost faith in Florida. In fact, at one point during the Depression, he was quoted as saying that his land holdings in the Sunshine State were his only solvent assets. As the 1930s went on, the stresses of the Great Depression began taking their toll on Barron Collier's health. He began suffering from high blood pressure and cardiac complications. In February 1939, at age 65, he fell ill on USEPA. His doctors rushed him to the New York Medical Center, where, on March 13th, he suffered a heart attack and passed away. After the death of their father, Barron Collier's three sons took over the family business and eventually managed to come out of bankruptcy proceedings. To this day, his family capitalizes on Barron Collier's once vast Florida land holdings, operating diverse business ventures that range from high-end real estate to agricultural interests.
I think he would be extremely proud of the way the county has developed.
During his lifetime, Barron Gift Collier invested $17 million of his personal money in Southwest Florida. His town, roads, hotels, and steamship lines spurred early growth from Everglades City to USEPA Island. Collier's empire laid the foundation for today's development.
His impact here can't be overstated. I don't know that much of this would exist without the impetus. I think eventually development would have occurred here, but he certainly in the 1920s unlocked the full economic and resort and tourist potential of Southwest Florida that has been driving this engine ever since.
There's no doubt that Barron Collier loved the Sunshine State. As his oldest son recalled many years later, Barron dreamt of Florida until the very end.
Finally, the sad hour came that Sam and I were shown into his room. He looked quite pert and chipper, but he looked a little surprised to see us. Well, he said, "How'd you get here?" Sam said, "We drove." Dad brightened up. "Oh, that's right, you like to drive. How'd the country look? Isn't it beautiful? You know, you can grow anything here." My brother and I exchanged glances and realized he thought he was in Florida. I like to think he still is. It's difficult for me to imagine anything he could have found in heaven that interested him as much.
To purchase a copy of this and other WGCU-produced programs, go to WGCU.org or call 1-888-824-0030. This program was produced for the citizens of Southwest Florida by WGCU Public Media. Show your appreciation for programs like these. Become a member of WGCU, a business supporter, or leave a legacy through estate or planned gift. Call or visit our website at WGCU.org.